visiting the Shanghai Museum back in 2011, I discovered, quite by chance, a dark room on the second floor that I'd never happened to notice before. It was hidden in the farthest corner of the numismatics hall, the gallery of ancient Chinese coins, and had very few visitors. There were coins glimmering in the darkness. Witnesses to a silent past. What was strange was that many of them looked familiar from my school years. Coins that came from the West, so far from home, all the way to China. I spent the next 6 months researching, without ever realizing that I was standing on the brink of a 3-year-long expedition to 11 countries across 4 continents, with amazing discoveries waiting for me at every turn. Marking a brand new chapter in the chronicle of relations between West and East. Contacts suffused with the history of the Armenian nation. This is a compilation of historical accounts linked to one another by the thin line of human perception. Perception of a story that has never been told before. We will travel on a journey from the dawn of antiquity to the present day. A journey into beyond. Geographically, Armenia is located north of Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers, a region that has witnessed continuous human activity since the birth of Middle Eastern civilizations. It is the natural meeting point of 3 seas and retains extensive evidence of ancient migrations. However, I was primarily concerned with one principal subject, that of trade relations between various regions. Trade and travel. 2 parts of the same formula, which allows us to look back deep into ancient history. In 2007, a startling discovery was made in the village of Armenia, located 120 kilometers south of Armenia's capital. Prehistoric structures were discovered in one of the area's karst caverns. This place is known as Armenia 1 archaeological site, or the Bird's Cave. And the reason for this name is quite obvious. Dozens of swallows are nestling in the cave's entrance chamber. Their commotion is louder than the human voice. No one but local children has climbed up here for years. But if you go further along the narrow gallery, you find yourself in a chilly world of silence and serenity. These jugs were found by archaeologists deep in the cave. The biggest of them are capable of holding up to 15 gallons of liquid. More than 24 such jugs have been found here. Some of them had grape seeds at the bottom. Wine-making tools were found as well. Radiocarbon dating of the artifacts revealed a somewhat unexpected outcome, a date 6,000 years before Christ. This dating seemed to be highly unlikely until it was confirmed through independent analysis by several European scientific institutions. We're in a Bronze Age winery. People made wine in this cave long before the Egyptian pyramids were built. Britain's Stonehenge didn't exist yet. Even the wheel had not been invented at this time. The artifacts demonstrated that wine was made in abundant quantities and was transported to nearby communities. These stalls are set up by the cave's entrance. At first, we thought that locals were selling Coca-Cola on this hot day, but it turned out to be the wine that has been produced in this area for thousands of years. Both the cave and the stalls are located by the highway that replaced an ancient caravan route. Just like in the Age of Antiquity, it connected Armenia and Persia and then ran eastward to Central Asia. If you followed this route straight to the east, a few months of walking would bring you to the borders of China. Europe and Asia have been involved in permanent relations since ancient times. Goods were traded, people knew each other well, and what is most important, many different nations lived and migrated along these trading routes, which covered huge distances. There were representatives of different cultures and beliefs, and apparently it was a system which functioned well due to the diversity of these cultures and traditions. The Armenians' role in international trade grew critically during the Hellenistic period. Due to Grecian military campaigns, the road to the east was paved, and soon, thousands of people born on this land would set out on the long journey which opens a new chapter in our story. We managed to find an exceptionally interesting map in Beijing. Over the last 50 years, the political situation in China has not been favorable for Western scientists. Therefore, many archaeological artifacts were discovered as recently as during the past decade. Just like this map from the time of the Song dynasty. Although it was made in the Middle Ages, it shows the world as it looked 2,000 years ago. These are the trade routes that run to the west. If you follow them, you'll reach Sihai, or the Western Sea. A little higher, they placed Anxi, which is depicted by these two symbols. Anxi is the Chinese name for the land of Arsaces, from the Arsacid dynasty that ruled both Persia and Armenia. The map was drawn based on the ancient Chinese book of Wei Lue, or the Peoples of the West. According to the book, the land that lies across 3,400 leagues is called Aman. This land is bounded by a mountain range in the north, and so we presume that Arman is the first indication of Armenia in ancient Chinese sources. These accounts were provided by ancient travelers, such as Jiang Xian, an imperial envoy. He revealed the Western world to China. Like many other discoveries, this one was made quite accidentally. However, formal relations between governments created the world we're talking about here. Jiang Xian's journey allowed China to realize that there were well-developed and wealthy lands lying farther to the west. Travelers called them Da Xin, or the Big Xin, comparing them to the Chinese imperial dynasty to underline the significance of these countries. In the meantime, Persia, Armenia, and Syria were discovering a colorful and diverse world in East Asia. These trade routes, although sometimes blocked at times of war, existed until the 14th century. In the 19th century, Ferdinand von Richthofen, a German scientist, discovered a fascinating common factor. All the countries located along these trade routes and coming into contact with each other were connected through a single commodity from an early stage in their relations: silk. Richthofen gave a new name to these commercial routes: Seidenstrasse, or the Great Silk Road. We have driven 2,200 miles from Beijing to the modern city of Urumqi, past the main commercial centers and across the famous Tarim Basin, aiming to get a feel for ourselves of what the journey along the Great Silk Road would have been like. We're crossing an area where dozens of towns have surrendered to the desert. But while some civilizations have gone for good, others still continue their quiet existence after thousands of years. It was a long and dangerous trip, with a single goal. Western people thought that silk came from a remote country in the east called Sarika, or Sarindia. But the secret of silk making had been kept hidden for centuries. Fragmentary information that reached Roman historians was far from the truth. For example, Virgil, one of Rome's greatest poets, thought that silk grew on trees, and that the native Ceres brushed it off the leaves. We were lucky enough to run into one of the very few operational silk factories where silk yarn is still produced in the ancient traditional way. We were able to observe every single step in this process. The The secret of silk's popularity lies in its strength. It was resistant to moisture while retaining the sense of coolness which was highly valued by inhabitants of the hot, dry lands of the Middle East. Clothes made of silk did not have folds where parasites could nest and breed. As time passed, silk became a symbol of wealth, indicating membership of the upper echelons of society. While the image of a caravan on the journey along the Great Silk Road became a classic symbol of the traders of the East. Like those in other countries, the cities of Armenia functioned as key international transit points along the Great Silk Road. This map, drawn by Roman historians almost 2,000 years ago, shows the world through contemporary eyes. This is Rome, the heart of the empire. Farther eastward is Tigran-Aserta, Armenia's ancient capital, an important transit point. Not far from it is the city of Artaxata, the present-day Artashat, a major commercial hub, from where the route continues to run eastward to Central Asia. At this point, the road forks, and its southern branch continues on to India. This is Taprobana Island, which is the ancient name for Ceylon, the present-day Sri Lanka. A winding line that resembles a human spine is the backbone of the trade route that signifies silk. Its starting point is right here, in a country called Serra Major, or China. The word Serra lies in the original root of the modern word silk. Looking at this diversity, one can imagine how lively and open the world was at the turn of the two eras. This was the time when Christianity was born. In a very short time, the age of antiquity was to be followed by the Middle Ages. A huge world condensed into 11 pieces of a single scroll. Poitinger's maps. Along with numerous artifacts, Chinese ceramics, and patterns of silk, the Poitinger table confirms the fact that the northern route in this part of the Silk Road went through the major cities of the Armenian highlands. At a later stage, Duin or Dvin became one such city. Its rise to prosperity began in the 5th century AD. In local markets, one could find all kinds of exotic goods brought from the east. After the adoption of Christianity, the Cathedral of St. Gregory the Illuminator was built in Dvin, and it was the largest church building of the 4th century. The city prospered up until 893, when a disastrous earthquake destroyed most of it. What is left today is just memories in stone. A great merchant once said, "If you set off on a journey for the first time and come back alive, The proceeds you gain for your merchandise should be sufficient to the end of your children's lives. It was the most epic of all journeys, from Europe to Asia, along the Great Silk Way. But there were serious hardships ahead. Like Taklamakan Desert. In ancient times, they called it the home of singing demons. For thousands of years, right up to the present day, travelers have got lost in these sands and grotesque rocks. While passing through this place, Xuanzang, a famous Buddhist monk and traveler, wrote, "All along the way from Dunhuang to this country, I saw only sand and rock. It is impossible to locate a pathway and measure distances. Only human and animal skeletons and camel manure prompt you where to go." Not only did the Silk Way connect the two worlds together, becoming a symbol of trade, something even more important started to take place a little later, when the Western world was suffering one of the most difficult crises in its history. While Asia entered its golden age. The Eastern Market, a place where you can buy anything. Since the age of the first travelers, it had become a melting pot for international relations. This is where East and West met face to face. Commerce is, in the first instance, a skill of understanding. That is why merchants learned foreign languages and listened to each other's stories with curiosity. Many of those nations represented an amazing mixture of different cultures. The Kushans spoke Persian, wrote Greek, and practiced Buddhism, but they came from eastern China. Silk and spices, nuts and dried fruits, precious stones and jade jewelry bought for a pittance at these stalls paid off 10 and 100-fold upon the merchant's return. The golden age of the Tang dynasty coincided with the dark ages in Europe that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. The main ideology of the first emperors was based on the principle of equal rights for Chinese and foreigners. Never before or after this period did China ever practice this doctrine again. The empire's capital city was Chang'an, or Xi'an. It could easily be compared to New York City today. The streets were a meeting place for Persians, Armenians, Jews, Greeks, Arabs, Byzantines, Hindus, Sultans, Turks, and even Africans. Sansai figures represent the nations of the Tang Empire, like this figurine of an Armenian wine merchant found in China. Every nation contributed something special. A society that lived in harmony, irrespective of religion, appearance, and language, shaped conditions for unprecedented intellectual and cultural growth. Art, literature, technology, and alchemy rose to a completely new level. This was the period when gunpowder, paper, and porcelain were all invented. A contemporary of the Tang Empire named Sun Tzu left a diary with accounts of daily city life. He talks excitedly about foreigners and exotic merchandise coming from all around the world to the eastern market of Chang'an. About streets that accommodated brothels, entertainment houses, wine taverns, and prostitutes who were given work permits. About the market square, where the heads of executed criminals were displayed for public edification. But the key point is that his story ends with the following statement: there is no other place in the whole world for a more peaceful and safer life, where one can give oneself to pleasures and forget all hardships and ills. Sun Tzu's story is so optimistic that his attempts to convey this internal feeling of self-sufficiency and happiness shine through the text almost 1400 years later. It wouldn't always be possible for mankind to reach such heights. And he was right. There was nowhere else like China in the world at that time. Just like many other nations, Armenians found in Asia both a place to trade and to live. The Armenian alphabet, introduced in the 5th century, had not yet become widespread enough for its traces to have been found in archaeological excavations along the ancient trade routes. But Armenians were mentioned by other nations in Sanskrit, Sogdian, and Chinese. During our journey, we decided to verify the validity of one ancient legend. "1,500 years ago, Armenia and Persia were unified in a single state, with a single ruler. But the time for change had come. Countless warriors, guided by the simple doctrine that there is only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, invaded the Middle East. 11 years of the Arab conquest were enough to overthrow the Sasanian Empire. The last surviving representative of the Persian royal dynasty, Prince Peros, fled to the east, accompanied by his allied Armenian princes. These headless statues stand by the tomb of Emperor Gaozong, one of the most influential rulers of his era. These are the statues of foreign envoys. No one knows exactly what happened to their heads. A local guide suggested that the heads were cut off 1,000 years ago so that foreigners would not be able to confuse them with future emperors. While the head of this statue did not survive, you can still read the name of Peros, Prince of Persia, the son of Yazdegerd III. The young prince fled to China, where his sister was an imperial concubine, cherishing the hope of receiving support against the Arabs in order to regain his lost kingdom. In his escape from the Arab offensive, Peros was accompanied by allied Armenian princes, all the way from Ctesiphon to Tsian. Gaozong welcomed the guests warmly. He granted the lands that from then on were called Tsi Wang Tsuan, the village of a Western king. Because this story is found only in the Chinese chronicles, it is known by very few people. But some researchers question whether Peros and his allies actually made it to China. So our film crew tried to find more information about this story. We thought that if the emperor granted lands to the prince in the area near the capital, then it should be looked for somewhere near the present-day Xi'an. But as so often happens, the information we needed evaded us at the beginning. We couldn't find any towns or villages formally registered under this name. All the locals we met told us they had never heard of such a village. But after a few hours of searching, we found ourselves at this place. This was Tsiwangswan, the eastern edge of the village of a Western king. But which one was it? We found out that there were 3 villages in the area with the same name. While Peroz and his allies were fighting the Arabs on China's western borders, Emperor Gaozong decided to enter into a treaty with them. He thought it would be better for the empire at that time. Those who fled from the west would never be able to return to their homeland. But their story lives on, due to the amazing monuments that have been standing here for over 1,500 years. We'd be making a big mistake if we overlooked this chapter in our story. One more reason to head back to the east. A sense of spiritual emptiness that had been growing since the decline of the Roman Empire coincided with the ideas of Christianity, suggesting that Jesus, who died on the cross, would save mankind from its earthly sins and open the gates of heaven. In an amazingly short period, thousands of people all along the shores of the Mediterranean and in the Middle East converted to Christianity. It took almost 300 years for Christianity to step out of the catacombs and caves where its followers were hiding from the Roman authorities to become an official state religion. At the beginning of the 4th century AD, Armenia became one of the first Christian nations in the world. But Christianity in Armenia was competing with Zoroastrianism, Persia's official religion. In the eyes of the Persian Shahs, Armenia was acting as an ally of their old rival, the Eastern Roman Empire, and Shah Yazdegerd II was obsessed by the desire to eradicate the new religion. He issued an order whereby all Christians in Armenia should be forced to convert to Zoroastrianism. When it became clear that this order had proved to be ineffective, the Persians launched an explicit military campaign. Persian forces that included elephant units crossed the border of their northern satrapy and marched deep into Armenian territory. In fact, neither army achieved a military victory, but after the Battle of Avaraish, Armenia achieved the more favorable position in the spiritual sense, since it managed to retain its religious identity. In the meantime, hundreds of miles to the west, in the city of Chalcedon, another battle for the future of the Christian world was raging. It was in 451 that the first serious split of the church into west and east took place. The split caused a mass exodus of Christians who refused to accept the canons of the Council of Chalcedon. The exiles were warmly welcomed in Persia, the cities of Central Asia, and even in India. Nestorianism, a new Christian doctrine, started to spread from Ctesiphon along the caravan routes via merchants and missionaries. For a long time it was thought that the first Christians appeared in China with the arrival of Jesuits in the 16th century, but this popular view has since been disproved. In 1625, a well-preserved stone stele was found. Inscriptions on the stele were made in 2 languages. One was Chinese, and the other was an unknown language that none of the local people could read. The artifact aroused a great deal of interest around the world, and soon local missionaries had managed to translate the message. The inscription on the stele told the story of a man who had come to China from the west in the year 635 AD and brought Christian teachings with him. I'm in Beilin, a museum of steles located not far from the present-day Xi'an. And here it is, the famous stele of Tang-era China. After close study, it appeared that the second language was Syriac. The inscription listed the names of some Christian monks who lived in Xi'an at the time. And on the top of the tablet, there is a cross. The name of the man who brought Christianity to China is depicted with pictograms as Alapen. Some researchers interpret this name as Reuben or Rabban, a very popular name in the Middle East at the time. We may never be able to find out who this Alapen was. On the other hand, the discovery of the tablet became a huge sensation in Europe. The argument over the stele continued for almost 200 years after its discovery. Many people blamed the Jesuit mission that was functioning successfully in Beijing at the time for falsifying and exaggerating their achievements. But no one was as fierce a critic of the Jesuits as Voltaire. In his essay on the manners of nations, he ridicules the Chinese stele. But even a great patriarch of the human mind like Voltaire could be wrong. More than 1,000 stone statues were discovered in the Chui Valley, near the city of Bishkek, from a time when the city didn't even exist. More than 500 tablets with inscriptions were discovered by Lake Issyk-Kul and all over the Chui Valley. The inscriptions, mainly representing tombstone epitaphs, are easily readable. But the most remarkable fact is that in addition to runic inscriptions, the tablets contain Syriac Armenian text that confirms the presence of Armenian communities in this region. One of these steles, or kairaks, was discovered in Central Asia by Russian archaeologists in the late 19th century. I had very little hope that it could have survived 2 world wars and the Russian Revolution. But a year after the start of our search, we received astonishing news. The kairak had been found in St. Petersburg, in one of the storerooms of the Hermitage Museum. We would never have expected to see this huge rock that could hardly be moved by 4 adults. For 120 years, this artifact was kept in a storeroom, completely forgotten. It stands out for one particular inscription, 1323, the date of the death of the Armenian bishop Hovannes. The Armenian text is followed by a Syriac translation. Christians in Asia consolidated around their religion, and Greek and Latin were replaced with Syriac, which became their international language. Its basic form lies at the base of many of Asia's national alphabets, such as Mongolian and Manchurian. This is Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, located not far from the Chinese border. The mystery of Issyk-Kul was born in 1856, when Pyotr Semyonov-Tianshansky, a Russian geographer, read the inscription on a medieval map. After that, he spent most of his life in Central Asia, searching for what was marked on the map as an Armenian monastery. The current explorations are facilitated by the Kyrgyz Academy of Sciences. The shores of Issyk-Kul were carefully explored in an attempt to find the monastery. As a result, a few assumptions were made. One of them suggested that the monastery was located in the city of Issyk-Kul, which could be the same as the ancient Toru Agir site. The second assumption was made by Semyonov-Tianshansky, who suggested that the monastery was located on the northeastern coast of the lake. And the third assumption that was noted in 19th century archive records placed the monastery at the bottom of Lake Issyk-Kul. The map discovered by Semyonov-Tianshansky was made in 1375 for King John I of Aragon. It is kept in the National Library of France in Paris. Today, the Catalan Atlas is considered to be one of the best examples of cartography and one of the most precise maps of the time. It was based on information provided by Marco Polo and Odoric of Pordenone. Until the 19th century, no one ever noticed the tiny picture by the edge of the 6th section of the map that displayed Central Asia. It contains a note about an Armenian monastery where relics of St. Matthew the Apostle were kept. We decided to test the assumption contained in the Catalan Atlas about the lakeside location. We were escorted to the site by Archpriest Victor, the dean of a small Russian Orthodox church located a couple of miles away. This bay attracted archaeologists' attention when locals started periodically to find various artifacts here. This small hill hides a system of man-made caverns. There is a theory that these catacombs are all that remains of the monastery today. These man-made walls are hugely impressive. They're based on the foundation of a huge structure that has been drowned in the deep waters of the lake. Issyk-Kul is one of those lakes in which the water recedes once in a generation and then returns again. Many buildings and structures found themselves standing in the water's way over the course of time. Some researchers insist that the drawing on the Catalan Atlas is purely schematic, and its location cannot be identified with absolute precision. Others suggest that the most precise of all maps made until the 14th century, where many other indications matched the real geographic locations, could not contain such an obvious error, and that the Armenian monastery is really located somewhere in the vicinity of Lake Issyk-Kul. we may be on our way to a great discovery, similar to Schliemann's, who persisted in the face of disbelief and mockery until he finally managed to uncover and present to the world the legendary city of Troy. In the early 13th century, the enormous energy that had been accumulating along the remote frontiers of Asia was set free by a new leader, the son of heaven as he would call himself, Genghis Khan. The Mongol conquest quickly overwhelmed most of the Asian continent, spreading from the shores of the Pacific to the Mediterranean coast. Dozens of nations became a part of a unified empire, bound together under the political consolidation known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. The success of such a rapid expansion was based upon new military tactics. The strength of the Mongol army was concentrated in its heavy and light cavalry. Its vanguard covered up to 100 kilometers a day. Mongol warriors used the deadliest weapon in their military armory: speed. They would often outrun the warnings of their imminent attacks, catching local populations off guard. Very few cities were successful in resisting this destructive force. By the time Genghis Khan's armies reached the Middle East, Armenia was living through its new golden age on the northeastern coast of the Mediterranean, where the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia flourished. Mongols first appeared in Asia Minor in the 1230s. They invaded Armenia and marched through Syria, devastating everything on their way, spreading terror. But there were a few independent Armenian principalities in the way of the Mongol armies by the Georgian border, and they gradually learned how to deal with the Mongols. Because Mongols were a completely different nation. Before that period, wars in Asia Minor, Syria, or Egypt were fought over religion. Christianity was seeking to eradicate Islam, while Islam wanted to suppress Christianity. But Mongols did not follow that trend. Religion meant very little to them. King Hethum I of Armenia, apparently one of the most far-sighted rulers in Armenian history, was carefully following events as they developed. As early as 1243, the combined Armenian and Mongol army destroyed the Seljuk Sultanate, Armenia's rival in the north. In the Battle of Kursedag, the Seljuk army was defeated. The Mongols and Armenians had now realized that they could work together. Armenians called them a nation of archers. In battle, Mongols predominantly used their bows, displaying enormous strength. Ultimately, the outnumbered Seljuk force suffered a terrible defeat. The Sultan had to flee, but he chose to send his family to King Hethum's court. The Mongols became aware of that and requested Hethum to give them up. It was a sensitive case, since the king's honor was at stake. But Hethum realized that if he refused, his head would most probably be the next in line. So he gave the Sultan's family up to the Mongols. This deal sealed their alliance. The emergence of the Mongols rekindled Europe's interest in East Asia. While a great number of European merchants still traveled for silk, few of them made any records that tell us about these remote lands. The idea of writing things down simply didn't exist. Some of them were illiterate, while others deliberately chose not to set down any description of the trade routes they used for fear of competitors. Instead, they competed in fiction, telling each other tales at the caravanserais while they drank wine together. And because of that, the remote countries of China and Southeast Asia became something fantastic and inaccessible in the minds of most Europeans. This veil of ignorance is still present to a certain degree up until today. In the National Library of France in Paris, there is a manuscript that contains accounts of one of the earliest journeys to the East. It seems that the Armenian kingdom dispatched several expeditions to the borders of China, to the city of Karakorum, the residence of the Great Khan. The first traveler was Sumbat Gundastable, the king's brother. And this is the original report of the trip. He came to Guyuk Khan. We do not know exactly what the subject of their conversation was, but apparently Guyuk made him understand that he was expecting to see the king himself, and not his brother. That he would only speak with an equal. Indeed, Sumbat was the first to travel there in the late 1240s, followed by King Hethum, who set out on his journey in the early 1250s. Just try to imagine what it was like. A king who personally traveled thousands of miles to the other end of the world. Hethum's journey began in Cilicia and continued on through the lands of eastern Armenia, occupied by the Mongols, past the city of Sarai, along the coast of the Caspian Sea and the ancient caravan routes to the very border of China. At the same time, another man also set out from Europe to the Mongols, Guillaume de Rubruck, a Franciscan monk sent by King Louis IX. Rubruck was willing to meet the Armenian king, but he had already set off on his return journey. However, in his report, Rubruck described the Armenian Nestorian priests he met in the Khan's court, and with whom he had a theological dispute. The first section of the road ran across Turkey. King Hethum was dressed as a merchant. According to Bahebreus, in the city of Edzincan, someone recognized him. If his identity was revealed, he would most likely be killed, and the last Armenian kingdom would cease to exist. And guess who saved the king? The Mongol envoy. He suddenly slapped Hethum in the face. By doing this, he made everybody think that the man could not be a king, that he was simply a merchant. In Karakorum, King Hethum appeared before the Great Khan. He left valuable accounts of that trip, being among the first travelers to describe China, the lands of Central Asia and Tibet. At that time, Marco Polo was only 1 year old. In 1307, Pope Clement V issued a decree in which the account of Hethum's journey was documented in a manuscript called La Flore des Histoires d'Orient, a history of the Tatars. But it was not only Hethum who was attracted by the wonders of the East. The Armenian art of the period contains some interesting details. Look at these almond-shaped eyes, which first appeared at the time of the Mongol Empire. Some historians say that Armenian craftsmen were trying to save their works from being destroyed by Mongols by making the faces look like Asians. Another theory suggests that this was how Armenian artists demonstrated their interest towards an unknown culture. Even Jesus and his disciples were given Asian faces in this old Armenian manuscript. And even the fish at Jesus' feet. Another manuscript contains interesting analogies. Like this 8-spoke wheel, a sacred symbol of the Buddhist wheel of law. And this wonderful pair of lions with typical features painted as heraldic gatekeepers. But this miniature arouses even more curiosity than the others. It contains the image of Archbishop Hovannes, the brother of the Armenian king. But why has a 4-foot Chinese dragon been painted on his robe? In this project, completed by an Armenian artist soon after the Mongol army marched through the city of Khromkla, there is a miniature that stands out. An amazing piece of art picturing the Holy Nativity with the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus and the 3 magi standing by. But if you look really closely, you'll spot Mongol figures there. He added Mongols, and one of those Mongols is pointing at an inscription that says Tatan Yerek Aysor, which means the Tatars came today, in Middle Armenian. This is simply incredible. Apparently, the artist walked down to the valley where the Armenian Catholicos was giving blessing to the Mongols before their Syrian campaign, and when he came back, he simply added what he had just observed. Today, we'd call it pure photojournalism. In 1375, Allied forces of the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt conquered Sis, the capital city of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. Less than a century remained before the fall of Constantinople, following which international trade would have to start exploring new routes to the east. The decline of the Silk Road marked the beginning of a completely new period of trade with the East. This time, people's attention shifted to this. For mankind, the sea has pretty much always been associated with freedom. These waves allowed people to forget about the problems and hardships waiting for them on shore in the reality of their world. It was a dangerous time, a time without navigation equipment, a time of superstition and ancient fear of the boundless spaces of the mysterious ocean. At first, people navigated close to the coastline. Losing sight of the land, especially during a storm when clouds covered the stars and the sun, could mean almost certain death. The earliest available accounts of long-distance sea travel date back to the era before Christ. Merchants could spend a few years on their journeys to the east. However, in the 1st century AD, one curious navigator who regularly sailed from the Red Sea to India noticed that at a certain season of the year, winds constantly blew in the same direction. In spring, they would sail their ships from the Persian Gulf to the east. Then, after a few months, they would change direction and head back, carrying the sailors home. Hippalus was the name of this navigator who discovered the principle of monsoons. In so doing, he laid the foundation of the practice of seasonal trade journeys to the Indian Ocean that continued up until the 19th century, the end of the great era of sail. Maritime trade attracted the Romans, then the Arabs, the Persians, Armenians, and finally the first Europeans who sailed through these waters. There are many facts that confirm the success of great merchants of the past. Like, for example, this ostrich that was brought to China from somewhere on the African coast. The Chinese seaports of the Song Empire became important international commercial centers, like Changzhou. This ancient map shows a trade route starting at Changzhou and running all the way to the west, a route which is more than 2,000 years old. The peoples of the East developed complete mastery of the art of navigation, and it's perhaps not surprising that the compass was invented by the Chinese. The invention of the compass was prompted by the ingenuity of ancient navigators who wanted to avoid paying taxes in the many ports scattered along the trade routes. It enabled them to sail far enough from the coast not to be spotted by the despised tax collectors. There is an interesting manuscript kept in the Institute of Ancient Manuscripts in Armenia, which has never seemed to go along with known historical facts. An ancient map is kept under strict protection along with other priceless manuscripts. It is written in Armenian on a small piece of parchment and belongs to the TO type. The specific feature of these maps is their eastward orientation. Traditionally, the central part is occupied by the city of Jerusalem. If you look carefully, you can read the words Indian world. Further along comes China. It's remarkable that among all the cities marked on the map, the fabled seaport of Zaiton is mentioned. This is the name by which Western navigators knew Changzhou. Contemporaneously with the prosperous community of Izikul, an Armenian trade outpost was functioning in Zaiton. This information comes to us from a letter by the Zaiton Archbishop Andrew of Perugia, dated 1326. It mentions a rich Armenian lady who handed the Armenian church she helped to build over to the city's Catholic mission. But how did Armenians acquire these maritime trade skills? It was in the time of the Cilician kingdom that Armenia had gained access to the sea, ever since the reign of the ancient king Tigranes the Great. The location was more than advantageous, a wide and long strip of the Mediterranean coast, with trade partners all over the region, mainly Venetians, Genovese, and to some extent Catalans. main commercial center was the great city of Ayas. This is exactly where Marco Polo's legendary journeys started in 1271. Let's see what he himself wrote. They have a city upon the sea, which is called Laias, at which there is a great trade. And whatsoever persons would travel to the interior of the east, merchants or others, they take their way by this city of Laias. For 80 years, Ayas remained the only Christian seaport in the entire eastern Mediterranean after the fall of Accra. And although the Armenian kingdom later surrendered to Muslim rule, Armenians would still maintain their traditional occupation: trade. Although they were Christians, Armenians were never involved in actually spreading Christianity. This is why they did not represent any danger in Muslim countries. Besides, after the fall of the Cilician kingdom, Armenians carried on as a huge trading community, deprived of statehood and land, not being able to compete with other states of the East economically, politically, or militarily. Therefore, Armenians enjoyed relative tolerance. Soon after, significant political and economic developments started to take place. With the fall of Constantinople, the supply of silk to Europe was halted. But Europeans had become strongly dependent on the product, especially in the cities of Italy, where the Renaissance was then at its peak. Armenian merchants went on establishing trade relations with European trade agents, first in Syria and then in Italian city-states. In the 16th century, a war broke out between Turkey and Persia over territorial and religious issues. In 1534, Persia lost Baghdad, a major financial center, as well as the trade routes that connected it to Europe. The Persian government licensed Armenian merchants to act as its exclusive trade agents. To stimulate trade in the northern regions, the cities of Julfa and Agulis were completely exempted from taxes. Armenians were given a unique opportunity to show their worth in commerce. There was another reason why the occupation of trader became so popular among Armenians. At that time, Armenia was divided between two empires, the Ottoman Turkey and Persia, ruled by the Safavid dynasty. Armenians were an ethnic and religious minority in a big Muslim country, where they could not occupy government posts or serve in the military. This should be borne in mind, since the military made up a major part of the aristocracy in that period. There was simply no choice at all. Commerce became the only occupation accessible for Armenians, the only alternative, if you will, the only way to show what they were worth. This caravanserai at the top of a big mountain pass is one of the few monuments in the region remaining from the period of flourishing trade. It was built in the 14th century to accommodate travelers and was destroyed later during the Turco-Persian Wars. The caravanserai stands beside a key trade route that crossed the Big Pass and connects the southern cities of Julfa and Agulis with a northern passage to the Black Sea and Anatolia. Julfa was subsequently transformed into one of Persia's key export-orientated trade centers. Its strategic role was emphasized by many European trade agents. When in 1590 the city fell under Ottoman rule for a decade, it was so rich that it managed to obtain protection in the imperial court and maintained relative independence. There was a special caste of prosperous merchants in Julfa called Khoja. A Khoja was a highly respected person. The city was ruled by rich merchant families united under a common idea, the idea of trade. The city mayor, or Kalantar as locals called him, would most often be a representative of this top caste. When in 1603, Abbas I of Persia, one of the most ambitious rulers of the empire, visited Julfa, he was struck by its wealth and splendor.
In 1604, a sinister plan matured in Abbas's mind to completely relocate the entire population of Iran's northern provinces, including Julfa and Khoja's craftsmen and merchants, to the country's central regions, giving them land near the city of Isfahan. The plan was carried out during 1604 and 1605. This forced relocation went down in history as the Great Surgun.
There is an interesting manuscript kept in one of the storerooms of the Armenian Institute of Ancient Manuscripts. Its author is Arakel Davrijetsi, who witnessed all these events. This is what he wrote. Persian troops sent to relocate the population would force people out of their towns and villages. And while the Shah was still hesitating, it became known that Turkish commander Jigal Oglu had already set out against him. Turkish forces pursued the migrants. On the bank of the river Arax, where hundreds of thousands of them accumulated, a terrible tragedy unfolded. There were hardly any boats available, and time was running out. When word spread that the Turkish army had been sighted in the distance, people started to panic, jumping into the river and leaving their belongings and cattle on the bank behind. Autumn flooding had made the water level in the river higher than usual. Nearly a quarter of the 300,000 migrants drowned in the river. The rest of them had to spend the winter in the mountains of northern Iran, where most of them died of cold and hunger. The old city was abandoned and deserted. But years later, Abbas sent troops to Armenia again, aiming to completely destroy the old Julfa. Apparently, there were people by then who had not been able to overcome their homesickness and had traveled back. Next spring, Julfa's merchant elite, Khojas and their families, arrived in Isfahan, where they would soon establish a whole new township hundreds of miles away from Armenia. As a tribute to the old city, the new one would be named New Julfa. Following the initial withdrawal of his troops, accompanied by a huge number of people, Shah Abbas left behind a desolate and devastated area, creating an additional barrier for the Turkish army.
One of the reasons behind this mass relocation was purely economic, to prevent the Armenian merchant community from feeding the Turkish economy. This is why Abbas moved the Armenian merchants to central Iran, hoping that they would contribute to the growth of the local economy, including development of trade relations with East Asia.
It took very little time for the Armenian settlers to build this new city with a population of 10,000. Abbas supported the immigrants to enable them to become established as soon as possible. To avoid conflicts with local Muslims, he issued an order that imposed punishment for harming Armenians or damaging their property. Rich families of Old Julfa retained all their privileges. The son of a former governor or Kalantar, Hoja Safar, was appointed the new city's Kalantar. Since Christians felt more comfortable dealing with other Christians, Abbas did not seek to convert Armenians to Islam. In less than a year, a new church was built. Over the next 10 years, the number of churches would grow to 13. Many representatives of the Hoja caste were appointed to high government positions as diplomats and envoys in the royal court. New Julfa's fame spread far beyond Persia's borders. In the travel journals of European trade agents, the city is described as a small state within a state. In 1619, Shah Abbas sanctioned the Armenian presence in Julfa once and for all, issuing a special order that gave Armenians the right to legally own land. This document, ratified with the Shah's personal seal, is kept at Holy Saviour Cathedral in the same city where it was issued around 400 years ago. The city of New Julfa turned into the foundation of a trade network that spread across the Armenian colonies from Europe to China and Manila. The outposts of this network were linked through merchandise and traders who traveled in high season by land and sea. However, in the early stages of trade expansion, India was the main source of Eastern treasures. In order to build a complete picture, we set off on a trip to this vast country in 2012. We only had a month to find and film the Armenian trade colonies scattered around 12 big cities, from Rajasthan to Tamil Nadu. Right from the beginning, it became obvious we had a tough task on our hands. We had to change taxis 3 times because the drivers simply didn't know where to go. As it turned out, the street we were looking for was located in Old Delhi. In the past, this part of the city was considered one of the most prestigious, with influential government officials and rich merchants living there. This is where we found a small Armenian chapel. The last Armenian family had left this neighborhood over a century ago. But as we walked in, we saw a big cross and a small Armenian prayer book sitting in front of the altar. There was an old cemetery behind the chapel's fence. A local lady agreed to be our guide once we accepted her request not to shoot close-ups of her and her family. Behind the fence, we saw a few tombstones. Some of them were being used as tables. On others, we saw wheat spread out for drying. The Indian families who live here watch over this sacred place, despite the fact that there is not a single Armenian around. And it seems none of them know who is buried under their feet.
What you can tell about this?
Sorry?
What you can tell about this?
I know. Sorry.
So when exactly did the Armenian history in India begin? At the very dawn of the Age of Discovery, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach India in the early 16th century. They were certain they would find completely unknown lands where nothing would be familiar. Just imagine their surprise when amongst thick jungle in Mylapore, they ran into a Christian community. These were Armenian settlers, who it seems had been living in this place for a long time. The accounts written by a Portuguese friar, Gaspar da Cruz, provide evidence that the Armenians knew the location of St. Thomas's grave, the patron saint of India, and took care of it. Today, some experts think that St. Thomas the Apostle had never traveled to India. They think the grave was actually that of Thomas of Cana, or Thomas the Confessor, Christian missionary who migrated here from the Middle East in the 8th century AD. But there is no confirmed historical evidence either way, and so the tradition is kept alive by the simple faith of millions of Indian Christians around the world. Perhaps Thomas's story will always remain hidden behind a thick shroud of mystery. But there is another place, thousands of miles from here, far to the east, that we definitely want to visit. The meaning of a few remarkable artifacts discovered in the city of Lianwingang has recently been reconsidered. These mysterious rock carvings were found here in the past. Who are these people? What are they doing here? Some theories suggest that these are the first Christians to reach the shores of China. Their posture and clothing seem to indicate their foreign origin. Is that a sculpture of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus? What is this man doing? You can see an object in his hand that looks like a T-shaped cross. In 16th century Portuguese reports from India, we read that shortly before his martyrdom, St. Thomas did actually make a journey to China, where he spent a few years spreading Christianity and then returned, leaving a few disciples to continue his cause. I'm somewhat skeptical about a radical hypothesis such as this, but if you try to look at these images impartially, it becomes clear that people could actually travel to these shores, and they apparently did. This rock is located only a few hundred meters away from the coast. You can even hear the sound of waves crashing on the rocks. Here in Chennai, right at the top of a hill called St. Thomas Mount, there is a church dedicated to St. Thomas. Our crew was the first ever to be allowed to film inside the church. We were taken aback by the great number of inscriptions we saw there. The local priests believe that they're written in an ancient Indian script. But in fact, they're written in Armenian, which is quite readable even today. For example, this is the name of St. Peter, Sub Petros. Most of the evidence of the Armenian presence remains well preserved right up to today. Much of it belongs to the late 18th century, which confirms that Armenians continued to take care of the church until a much later date. Some of the inscriptions are encrypted. This practice was common in the Armenian region and has been found on many tombstones. Unfortunately, without a special key, these inscriptions will be impossible to decipher. Our search for old Armenian colonies in India seems to be turning into a real adventure. They're found in the most unexpected places. According to this inscription, this bridge was built in the 18th century with financial support from an Armenian merchant, one Petros Voskan. His grave can still be found in a city suburb. The small Armenian diaspora has left a visible trace in the history of such a huge continent as India. In the 16th century, a small group of Armenian merchants was invited by Emperor Akbar the Great himself to visit the capital of the Mughal Empire. Akbar was a clever ruler. He could sense great changes approaching along with the dawn of the age of the gunpowder empires. And he believed that the Armenians' relations with Persia, Turkey, and Europe should be used for the benefit of his empire. Some of these Armenians were given prestigious titles in the imperial court, like, for example, Abdul Hai, who was appointed as justice minister. One of the reasons why Armenians prospered during the Mughal period was that they could speak Persian, because they had migrated from Persia and later from New Julfa. And they were fluent in Persian, which was the official language of the Mughal court. So this was one of the reasons behind giving Armenians all those trade privileges. They knew the language. They spoke the language of the court. By the end of the 17th century, most of the Indian Ocean was controlled by the British East India Company, and it developed very special relations with local Armenian merchants. The city of Calcutta, founded by a British trade agent, Job Charnock, in 1690, became the capital of British India. Just a few miles away from here, you'll find the Calcutta Market that has been located in this place for several hundred years. The core of the market is the Armenian Street and the Church of the Holy Nazareth, one of Calcutta's oldest Christian churches. By the early 17th century, the number of Armenian communities in India had grown significantly. But nowhere did they prosper quite as much as in Calcutta. Hundreds of names can be read on the tombstones at the Holy Nazareth's churchyard. Each of them has their own story, their own destiny. But some of these stones can shed more light on the history of the city itself. This is the grave of a woman whose name was Reza Bibe, the wife of a merchant called Sukyas. The presence of women at such an early stage is evidence of the merchants' deliberate attempts to establish permanent bases in India and other countries throughout East Asia. But I was primarily interested in Reza Bibe's death date, 1630. In the courtyard of St. John's Church, we found Job Charnock's mausoleum. A memorial inscription reads that he founded Calcutta in 1692. That's more than 60 years later than Reza Bibe's grave, just a couple of miles away. The establishment of such a strong trade diaspora, so far away from the homeland, became possible due to a few key traits characteristic of the Armenian nation. For example, family traditions. Family values and respect for elders were highly rated. In trade, especially in the nodal center of New Julfa, some of the most influential families developed a uniform mechanism whereby rich merchants or khwojas appointed their close relatives or their own sons to represent them as agents in remote colonies. Trust between family members played a crucial role. There was nothing worse than lost reputation within this trade network. News about an unfair deal or a dishonest person would quickly spread over the entire network, from China to Persia. And once that happened, no one would want to enter into further dealings with that person. Another secret behind their effective operation was the timely supply of information. Personal correspondence between trade agents was crucial in linking hundreds of merchants scattered thousands of miles away from each other. Those letters contained information about important events that could affect their trade, such as new laws, exchange rates in different parts of the world, and even weather reports. Such exchange of valuable information was the cornerstone of a success that European companies lacked at the start of their trade expansion in the Indian Ocean. A peculiar Julfa dialect developed over time that only a few people are able to read today. It contained many foreign words adopted from the languages of their foreign trade partners. And this special language also turned into a unique code that protected the information from competitors. The Armenian diaspora grew so strong that an important treaty was signed in 1688 between the British East India Company in London and the Armenian trading community, represented by an influential merchant called Fanos Kalantar. This treaty ensured equality for the Armenians with the British throughout all Asian colonies, forts and settlements. They gained the right to charter British ships and build churches, and were exempt from taxes in all British territories. However, even such a far-reaching treaty as this could not save them from troubles at sea. Attacks by pirates during this period became the worst nightmare for commercial vessels. Apparently, the most remarkable case involved the famous privateer William Kidd, who captured an Armenian ship, the Kedam Merchant, in 1698. It was an almost 500-ton sailing ship, chartered by 4 Armenian merchants and Moorish Muslims. This was an unprecedented case in the history of piracy. Despite the fact that Kidd had informal authorization from the British Crown to practice piracy, Armenians pressed the Mughal Sultan to blockade all British trading posts in southern India. The scandal rose to international level, and in order to calm the merchants down, Kidd was put on trial and publicly executed by hanging in London in 1701. Documents that could have saved him from the noose were mysteriously lost and were recovered only 200 years later. Armenian merchants received nothing but a small amount of compensation. Information about the location of the ship and its 200,000 rupees worth of cargo was taken to the grave. The ship had vanished like a ghost, continuing to stir people's imagination. Pirate treasure has become a legendary theme over the centuries that have followed. But no one has ever told William Kidd's story in as masterly a fashion as Edgar Allan Poe in his short story, The Gold Bug. The story of William Legrand and his servant Jupiter accidentally discovering the treasure supposedly buried by Captain Kidd became a literary masterpiece, and the first short story ever written in the adventure detective genre. The legend lived on for about 300 years, until one day in 2007, a long-awaited discovery was made in the vicinity of Santo Domingo Island in the Caribbean Sea. After a few years of unsuccessful attempts, a team of researchers from the University of Indiana, led by Professor Charles Beaker, had finally found something in the sky-blue waters of the Caribbean. Something definitely worth celebrating. Some 3 meters below the surface of the ocean, the researchers ran into the barely recognizable remains of a ship, which was identified as the Kedam Merchant. The type of vessel and the timber it was made of, Indian teak, were uncommon for Europe and the Americas. This vessel could only have been launched from a dock in southern Asia. All the romantic tales about pirates of the Caribbean suddenly came true. Numerous enthusiasts had been trying hard for decades to find traces of the Kedam Merchant, while all this time, she was just around the corner. the team lifted up one of the ship's guns that weighed about 700 kilos and was well preserved. Since vessels of this type would usually set sail without an armed escort, they somehow had to protect themselves. But Kere Merchant seems not to have been so lucky. She subsequently became the doomed symbol of the growing power of trade. And Captain Kidd was one of the first to be sacrificed on the altar of commerce, that newborn deity. As the trade network expanded, Armenians felt the need to document and classify their vast experience. A school of commerce was founded by a Julfan merchant called Kostant, where students were taught foreign languages, mathematics, and the basics of trade. The sons of rich Khwajas were admitted as the school's first students. A special textbook that survives to the present day provided guidance to young merchants, as well as rules of etiquette and recommendations on conduct when dealing with the different cultures and peoples of Asia and Europe. The school soon became a guarantee of future success and respect, and consequently, even the middle-class craftsmen of New Julfa did their best to arrange for their sons' admission to Kostant's school. But the most vivid traces in history were left by merchants' travel journals, which provided detailed descriptions of their routine dealings in the world's most remote areas. Of all the trade-related manuscripts, none has such magnetic force as Hovhannes Terdavtyan's ledger that contains a detailed description of his journey from New Julfa to Tibet. He was a typical Armenian merchant of his time, a part of the intercontinental trade network. Reading his ledger helps us to understand how this entire mechanism functioned. For example, it says that he set off for India from the Persian port of Hormuz. On the 21st of March, he arrived in Surat, where he made a donation to a local church and hired 2 Armenian servants whom he agreed to pay 40 and 50 rupees a year. Joining a local party, they reached Patna, and after crossing the Himalayas, they entered the mysterious land of Tibet, on their way to the capital city of Lhasa. Tibet and its neighboring countries had attracted Armenians long before the Age of Discovery. In the 15th century, Portuguese missionary Bento de Gois and his Armenian guide Sahak traveled more than 5,000 kilometers all the way to Beijing, still known then as Khanbalik. Bento died on the way, apparently poisoned by Muslim fanatics, but he instructed Sahak to continue the journey and reach China. These accounts were found in the records of Matteo Ricci, who was one of the first missionaries to settle in Beijing. Due to Bento de Gois and Sahak's journey, the Western world finally learned that Marco Polo's Cathay and China were the same countries, just like Khanbalik and Beijing were 2 names of one and the same city. This is a medieval astrolabe made in Armenia. Such instruments were used by travelers and merchants making their way to Asia. The intricate craftwork makes it look like a piece of art, rather than the navigational instrument it actually is, which allowed trade agents to find their way by the stars. agents such as Ter Davtian, who on the 28th of September 1686 finally walked into Lhasa. He wrote in his ledger that he would have had great difficulty surviving in this strange country without knowing the local language and customs if other Armenians hadn't helped him. This information is very important since it confirms the existence of an Armenian community in Tibet at that time. Tibet did not welcome foreigners, but it seems that somehow the Armenians had gained some privileges. This letter, bearing the seal of a high-ranking Tibetan official, was addressed to the Armenian community. Our project was the first to translate and analyze its content. We learned that by this letter, Armenians were granted trade freedoms and were allowed to move in and out of Tibet. This letter guaranteed them safety, accommodation, and food during their trips. Very little was known of Tibet until the early 20th century. For hundreds of years, the bulk of the country's population lived in complete isolation, surrounded by the sky-high peaks of the Himalayas, which allowed them to shape a unique cultural ecosystem. The country's language and ancient traditions both scared and attracted the foreigners who first came to this mysterious Asian highland. After spending a total of 5 years in Lhasa, Ter Davtian went back to India in 1692. The last record in his ledger was made in the Indian city of Hooghly. Ter Davtian's journal is not the only manuscript of this kind. There are at least 24 other travel journals, many of which have not been researched yet. They contain exclusive information about the economy of different regions at the dawn of globalization, and valuable ethnographic observations, together with notes on the customs and traditions of different people, many of whom vanished a long time ago. These are descriptive maps of trade routes that crossed entire continents with their unique cultural history. But to follow a traveling man on the journey away from his home, this nodal center that connects all of the various places of the world, is the most fascinating experience. For a long time, the place name Yeni Dunya, found in one of these travel journals, could not be identified. It could be translated literally as land beyond the borders of the known world. In other words, the New World, which actually meant America. A story that happened back in the 18th century left an interesting trace in history. Mexico's National Archive is housed in a former prison. But today, instead of prisoners, the cells house centuries-old manuscripts. So I set off for Mexico, following the traces of Don Pedro, an Armenian who was put on trial by the Inquisition around 400 years ago. Don Pedro was a young Armenian merchant who traveled from China to Acapulco on one of those merchant ships in the early 18th century. He was attracted by the prospect of making his fortune from the local mines that produced silver, a key export product of the New World. documents are dated 1731, when he was called to court based on an accusation against him. At this time, the Mexican Inquisition was particularly powerful and determined because the local Aztec population had continued to practice their traditional religion. Although Don Pedro was not a pagan, nonetheless the Catholic Church perceived the canons of the Armenian Apostolic Church as heresy. Records of the court proceedings run to 17 pages. They provide Don Pedro's detailed biography. His real name was Petros de Zarate, which meant Petros, son of Sarhat. He was born in New Julfa and had followed the classical route of a merchant, traveling from India to China. However, he decided not to stop at what he had accomplished so far and went on traveling. In 1722, he boarded a ship named Manila Galleon that set off from Canton and sailed to Acapulco, where he met a Mexican entrepreneur, José de Vengoche, who persuaded him to invest his assets in silver. It took a few years until the investment started to pay off. By the time of the trial, Petros had lived in the New World for around 9 years, and had apparently acquired a good command of Spanish and a great deal of respect and influence in the city. In the end, the Inquisition dropped their charges, accepting his promise never to spread heresy again. It is not known what became of Don Pedro in the end, whether he stayed in Mexico or traveled back home. But this fascinating episode allowed us to trace just how far the Armenian international trade network extended in the period of its greatest growth. The next generations were to witness substantial changes all over Asia. Hence, instead of India and Persia, the leading role passed to China. And this is where our journey comes to its end. These shores bear witness to the rapid transformations of the modern world. 200 years ago, the roar of the Industrial Revolution reached them from Europe. A little later, conventional sailing vessels were replaced by steamboats, and then by huge container ships. These enormous vessels are capable of carrying far more cargo than even the most fertile minds of the past could ever have imagined. In this constantly changing world, there were lots of people who wanted to change China as well. By the 19th century, the need for an adapted Chinese translation of the Bible as a critical re-education tool had become a big priority. This is Zikawei Library, in the very heart of modern Shanghai, the last shelter for colonial archives after the demise of the old China. A huge quantity of pre-First World War history is stored within the walls of this mansion. One of the issues of a Canton periodical, the Chinese Repository, contains an article dated 1835 regarding the first Chinese translation of the Bible. The translation was made by an Armenian whose name was Ioannis Lasar, or Hovannes Gasarian. His story brings us back to India. This time, we headed for Serampore. We managed to find out that Lhasa was born in Macau, in the family of a rich merchant who came from New Julfa, and was educated by 2 Chinese servants. In 1802, Lhasa travelled to India, where he was hired as a translator for the British consulate. After a while, he was commissioned to undertake a Chinese translation of the New Testament, together with Dr. Joshua Marshman. Here, in the hot jungles of Bengal, Lhasa and Marshman started their work. They suffered seriously from malaria, while an acute shortage of books and dictionaries hampered their progress. This is the house where the companions would meet and work every day for 7 long years. Marshman wrote, "During the translation, Mr. Lhasa sits down at my elbow, where he sits from month to month and year to year, and translates from the English, assisted by his knowledge of the Armenian. Then we read every single passage, every single phrase, and every word to make sure it is as close to the original as possible." The difficulty of translating biblical texts into Chinese symbols was a serious obstacle for the first and future Christian missionaries in China. But a good match of the Chinese, Armenian, and English languages in Lhasa's head helped to overcome that barrier. The book was finally published in 1813. The original edition containing the author's notes is still kept in the Serampore College Library. This is the first ever Chinese translation of the Old and New Testaments. Despite many linguistic errors, these pioneers certainly did a grand job. Young Lhasa suffered a tragic fate. He died from a fever, most probably malaria. There are 6 colonial cemeteries just a few miles away from the college. We didn't have much problem finding Marshman's grave. There were 3 withered wreaths beneath his tomb. Today, much of his world is consigned to oblivion. Part of the cemetery was totally flooded because of monsoon season. All the other tombstones we examined were so worn by the ravages of time that the names on them had been erased forever. Any of us could simply have walked past the grave of a young Armenian without even knowing it. The trade network started to slowly die out in the early 18th century, when its nodal center, New Julfa, was seized by Afghan forces. While the British East India Company started to view Armenians as rivals rather than partners. However, the collapse of the old trade system brought along something new, something that had never bothered the minds of Julfan merchants before: the revival of national self-consciousness. Identifying themselves as part of one nation, irrespective of their birthplaces and habitats, Armenians suddenly sensed their association with this big unity. The 18th century, viewed as the age of Armenian enlightenment, gave rise to the ideas of statehood. The first printed Armenian language periodical, Azdarar, provided a good opportunity for the voices of a small group of Armenian intellectuals to be heard. And although its title page still carried forthright commercial advertising, the first signs of a future struggle for national identity could already be detected. Here in India, thousands of miles away from the historical homeland, Armenia's first constitution was born. The effects of this struggle would manifest themselves many years later, in 1918, when a unified Armenian state was established for the first time in 700 years. We have traveled a very long journey, all the way from antiquity to the present. We saw how the trade network developed over the course of many centuries, and how men and their ideas traveled together from west to east. Going deep into history, we journeyed on, discovering one chapter after another. We cleared our way through to the past. On occasions, we had to clear it literally. This old mansion belongs to the Apgars, once a prosperous merchant clan. Today, it's home to the last representative of this family, who is living out the rest of her days being looked after by a Hindu driver. Not all of the facts have been explained as fully as we might have wished them to be, but we have come across some fascinating stories. In a small park in Shanghai, we found this headstone from the grave of a 5-year-old Armenian boy. What other stories lie ahead? You understand, looking at this, that there are many questions that still have to be solved. All our discoveries are just the first step towards what waits for us ahead. All discoveries take mankind closer to the truth, and the world is full of amazing and wonderful surprises waiting to be uncovered.